Welcome to a festive edition of the Corny and Barry podcast. So, my name's Tiffany and I work in the marketing department here. And I'm joined with Margherita and Hebe today, who are both in our buying department. And we're going to be talking about sweet wine. So, sweet wine it feels a little bit neglected, and a lot of people say that they don't really like it. So we just wanted to talk a bit about it today because it's quite a fascinating topic. It's not just about how it tastes, what you can eat with it, which is obviously very important, but it's also about the techniques and methods used, which is really interesting. So I'm going to hand over to Margherita first and ask you, what would you normally like to drink at Christmas?
Hello. At Christmas, well, I'm Italian and I grew up in Italy, so typically we've always had an Italian sweet wine for Christmas. In our Christmas offer this year, we've got the Vinsanto, so that's always accompanied desserts in Italy, actually. But this year I'm in England and we will gather with family, and so it will be good to have, yes, something probably typical from Italy, like the Vinsanto, but I would also take this as an opportunity to show something different, something that maybe people don't know, because it's nice when we get together not only to be together and be happy, but also to challenge people or take them on an adventure. And so this year I would like to take the Chenin Blanc from Justenberg. Because it's maybe something that, you know, our families might have not tried yet, and I want them to try something new and maybe discover something that they might like for the future.
So have you got a mix of Italian and English people for Christmas?
No, this year just English.
Just
actually.
English,
yes,
okay.
yes. So I can challenge them with different things, yes.
Well, and Hebe, what are you going to be drinking?
My family's quite traditional at Christmas, so when it comes around to dessert, it's always Christmas pudding with sauterne, and then some cheese later on in the evening when we've got, you know, tiny bit of room for some more food. That's when we would have some ruby port, probably
Nice.
vintage, which is always really nice. I always think of sweet wine and Christmas do go hand in hand, you know, especially mince pies and things like that. It makes you feel super festive. So
I feel like it's one of those things where people say, oh no, I don't really want sweet wine, but it's actually quite a welcome addition to the end of a meal. You get that little bit of hit sugar.
exactly, it keeps you going through those
exactly.
those terrible games you have to play with your family. You know, when you have to play charades, a glass of port will get you through.
Yes.
It's a good tip, actually.
Yeah.
I'll bear that in mind. So let's go into a little bit more of the technical side of things. So as I was saying briefly before, there's lots of different techniques, there's different styles of sweet wine. So what actually makes a wine sweet, and how is that achieved?
Okay, so there are three main ways to make a wine sweet. First of all, in wine, when during the fermentation, what happens is the sugar is converted into alcohol. And the idea when you make a sweet wine is to have much more sugar than normal, so then when all the alcohol, when all part of the sugar is transformed into alcohol, you still have leftover sugar, which makes a sweet wine. So, three main ways. One is to add the sweetness before the fermentation, one during, and one after fermentation. So, to have the sweetness before the fermentation, how can a producer do that? Is by, one, drying the grapes. So they can decide to dry the grapes on the vine, or so let them be on the vine for a little bit later. For example, if they would normally pick, I don't know, in August or September for a normal wine, to make a sweet wine, you leave them on the vines until maybe September, October, or even later, so that little by little the berries shrivel, the water evaporates, and you get a bigger concentration of flavors, but also of sweetness. And when you go and make a wine, it becomes sweeter. Or you can dry the grapes after picking. So you pick the grapes, and then you leave them out to dry. This is what happens, for example, with Vinsanto. So they leave them out to dry for 3 months. So again, they shrivel and they get much more concentrated in sugar and flavors. Or you can let the berries be affected by noble rot. So noble rot is a fungus, and it attacks the skins, and it makes the skins of the berries thinner, so that again the water evaporates and you are left with more concentrated flavors and sugars. Another way again is to freeze the grapes. So if you leave the grapes on, not only in autumn but throughout the winter, they can freeze, and then with a special technique you are able to take out the crystals of frozen water basically, and you're left again with the flesh that is much more concentrated and sweet. Another method, the second, as I was saying, is to add sweetness during the fermentation. So you can do that by filtering the yeast out. The yeast are what starts the fermentation. So if you take the yeast off, for example, what happens with Moscato d'Asti, you stop the fermentation, so you are left with very low alcohol. Moscato d'Asti usually has about 5.5%, and it's sweet. Or again, you can remove the yeast by fortifying. So producing fortified wines, you add alcohol and you stop the fermentation and you get a sweet wine. The last way is to add sweetness after fermentation. Of course, it's prohibited by law to add sugar as such, but you can sweeten it in other ways. For example, there are naturally sweet liquids like unfermented grape juice that you can add to then have your final sweet wine. Yes.
Also with
different ways.
yeah, like sweetened sherries as well. They sort of blend in PX, so Pedro Jimenez, into olorosos and stuff to make a lovely sweet style of sherry as well.
So very different styles.
Yeah,
Yes.
and there's a lot to it.
There's a
You
lot
summarised
to it.
that beautifully, but it was
And very short.
very fast paced. Quick overview. So sweet wine's more complicated than I believe people think, and so there's a lot to do with dehydration and concentration of the sugars, and then there's just the sort of adding sweetness.
Yes.
Yeah. And then Hebe, what about ports? You mentioned port before. How does that differ?
So port, as Margherita mentioned, is they stop the fermentation by adding fortification spirit. So it's like 77% grape spirit that they add when the wine has reached about 6% ABV. And so then that obviously kills all the yeast, and then they filter and drain it quite quickly after that in order to get this high alcohol but also sweet wine that still has lots of fresh flavour characteristics that you kind of expect with red wine, for example. So a fresh ruby port is still going to have lots of those red wine characteristics and less of the oxidative characteristics you get in other styles of sweet wine sometimes. But with port, the key thing is that because you're only getting to sort of 6% ABV during fermentation, that's only a couple of days that you have to extract as much flavour and tannin and colour from the grapes as possible. And so there's quite a few different methods of doing that. The most traditional is foot treading. So you get, a line of men and women standing, arm in arm, like literally just stomping down on the grapes back and forth after a long day of picking. It's a pretty thankless job. It's not very glamorous, but it always looks cool. I always think I'd like to do it, but probably the reality is not very nice.
Quite tiring.
Yeah. So now there's sort of more modern methods, so robotic lagares, which kind of replace foot treading, which use silicone pads that essentially do exactly the same thing that feet do. Also things like pistons that really pump the wine sort of over itself, or classic techniques that you might be familiar with, so pumping over, punching down, but all of it has to be sort of as extractive as possible within those days, because ports are normally, you're trying to make wine that's going to age and going to stay in bottle for a long time, so it needs to have a lot of tannin and colour in order to kind of sustain itself through its life. So the extraction is super key there. And then, 77% grape spirit, which is why sort of port, compared to other fortified wines, has like a slightly more grapey taste. Sometimes you get that sort of grapey spirit nose, or that slightly more noticeable spirity nose, and that's what tells you, oh my god, this is port, because everything else is fortified normally with more like 96% grape spirit, which is essentially entirely neutral. But yeah, I mean, I've just done my fortified wine exam, so
Yeah, I was just going to ask, did you have any port blind when you were doing your exam?
we did. We had quite a poor, cheap white port.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
But did you pick
Sadly.
up on that sort of acquaintance?
Instantly smelt, the
Okay.
aguardente, the grape spirit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh. So just quickly going back towards Noble Rot or Botrytis cinerea. So there's a lot of famous wines that use that technique. So for example, Tokai or Sauterne. But how exactly does it affect the grapes, and therefore what flavours does it impart in the wine? How can you pick out a wine that's had Noble Rot?
Okay, so as I mentioned before, the noble rot is a fungus, and it is rot, but is the noble kind because it doesn't give, musty then taste to the wine. Obviously, it's a good type of fungus that attacks the skins of the berries, and it causes little wounds, and it causes the skins to get thinner and thinner over time, and then it allows the water to evaporate from the berries, and the flesh that remains inside is more concentrated, so more concentrated flavors, more concentrated sugars. You need very specific weather condition to be able to carry out noble rot, so not everybody can do it. It depends on the areas. That's why it happens more in some parts of the world than others. It needs to have the right amount of humidity to cause it, but not to turn into the bad rot. And it needs a lot of attention on the vineyards, so the producer needs to be on it every day and check that the berries are developing the right kind of rot. The wine resulting from this would have very distinctive honeyed notes, and more on the dried fruit, like dried apricots and dried peaches, sometimes even a bit pineapple-y. So this kind of aromas that you can find, and flavors. Whereas if you use grapes that have not been affected by noble rot, you would have more primary fruit aromas and flavors like citrus and fresh stone fruit instead. And it's the wines that are made with grapes affected by noble rot are usually very luscious and very, very rich.
Does it do anything to the texture of the wine as well?
Yes, it creates a very
Like viscous almost.
Yeah,
like oily.
that's a good word.
viscous texture. Thank you. So it's you can feel it in your mouth. It's it's not watery at all. It's all the opposite.
Yeah.
Is beautiful.
But yes, important to note that whilst it's viscous, it's not syrupy.
It's not syrupy, yes, and it's not too heavy, because it always has, and this is obviously key in the winemaking, it always has a good level of acidity to keep it going and not becoming as heavy and really difficult to drink. So a good balance is the key.
And obviously, because there's very specific weather conditions, I guess that means from vintage to vintage.
There can be variations, yes,
Yeah.
and there can be years when producers might decide not to produce it because they don't have the healthy berries. And that's why usually it takes quite a premium price for the wine.
Yeah. I went to Sauterne a few years ago now, and one of the things I took away from it was they were talking about the vines and the production, and they were saying typically a vine in that area might produce 1 bottle per vine.
Yes.
But when they're making Sauterne, they produce a single glass of wine because of how concentrated the grapes are. So you can understand why it's a premium product.
Exactly.
And it's such meticulous viticulture as well, because it takes several passes through the vineyard to only pick, botrytis infected grapes, and so you're literally going through like over a month's time.
Gosh.
In and out. I think the Justenberg wine that we have in our Christmas offer, the Noble 8 Harvest, South African wine, that took 11 passes through the vineyard to make. So
11.
11.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Those poor pickers. Glad we're not doing it. At least we just get to taste it at the end.
Yes.
Absolutely.
We've got actually a specific type of Tokai in our festive selection this year. And my understanding of that is that there's a mix of healthy grapes, what we would call healthy grapes, and then the botrytized grapes as well. So how does that affect the flavour profile of the wine, having a mix of both?
Yeah, so just to touch base on what I just mentioned before, the grapes affected by noble rot would give to the wine this distinctive honey notes, which you can find in this wine, but because it's got a percentage of also healthy grapes, not affected by botrytis, the others are healthy as well, but you will have also this mixture of so honeyed notes, but also fresh primary fruit flavors, citrus peel, fresh stone fruit that combine together. So it's maybe more, slightly fresher style than maybe a Sauterne.
Yeah, and it might pair a bit better with some of those more savoury dishes because it's got a little bit more acidity
Yeah,
to go with it as well.
Yeah.
Because it's, Samorodny is the style that we're talking about, the Tokai Samorodny, which means, I think it comes from Polish originally, but it means like as it comes, so they pick all in one go. So the grapes are both botrytized and not. So
they're not doing 11 passes.
They're not doing 11 passes.
But it's a great result. I think, I tasted it a little while ago, and it had this lovely sort of sweet and sour note, which I thought was unusual but interesting, and as you say, it means probably more versatile when it comes to food as well.
Absolutely.
As all dessert
and
wines.
you can drink it any time of the year.
Yes. Sweet wines aren't just for Christmas.
This is key.
It's very true.
Just touching back on port. So you mentioned ruby and vintage before, but there are different styles. Could you just briefly tell us a little bit about the different styles?
Absolutely. There's quite a few different styles of port. So ruby and vintage I've sort of touched on, but there's also tawny port, which is port, like red port with quite a lot of oxidative aging. So it spends time in sort of smaller barrels with more exposure to oxygen, and isn't usually released until sort of at least 3 almost 5 years afterwards, but often a lot longer. So you get tawnies with an indication of age. They're like, for me, some of my favourite wines in the world. So 10-year, 20-year, keeps going after that. Our 20-year, the Corny & Barry's 20-year tawny is like one of my favourite things. I always buy some for my dad for Christmas. But it makes this sort of delicious caramel, toffee, leather, coffee, sort of more of those tertiary notes, along with this lovely sweetness and freshness. I serve tawnies chilled usually, and they go super well with fruity desserts. I find sort of like dried fruit, so fruit like Christmas cake, something like that would be
Perfect.
Delicious. But you also get white ports as well, which I'm a big fan of. White port and tonic is a very classic drink. It's actually a very good summer drink, so maybe less so for this time of year on this sort of snowy day in London that we've been having. But white ports you can also get with an indication of age as well, like tawnies, and they can be really, really premium and great quality. And then other things to look out for if you're you want vintage port but maybe don't want to splash out so much on them because they are quite a premium product. You could get things like single quinta, so when it's from a single estate and a single vintage, but maybe they didn't decide to declare a vintage for that whole year, the port house. They might have just chosen a particular vineyard that was doing really well and then made a single quinta port. And also collietas, which have tawnies and white port that have 7 years of age. Really nice, approachable style, kind of good for starting off if you're sort of venturing into the world of port.
So if you're a port novice, that's the one for you.
Yeah, that would be the one.
And you were talking before about the structure of a port and how you want it to last. So would that only really apply to vintage ports, or are there different styles that you could age?
Different styles. I mean, so vintage ports are and single crusted are sort of the only ports that are going to age in bottle. So most other ports are kind of bottled ready for drinking, which is a bit of a misconception. I think some people think they can be leaving their bottle of port, just classic ruby in their cupboard for years, and then it comes out and it's not very nice. But yeah, vintage port is definitely made for aging in bottle for a very long time, which is why it makes really good gifts for people's birthdays and things like that. Because 40-year-old port is going to be absolutely delicious, but it will throw a lot of sediment. That is the warning. So crusted port is the same. It also has, it's a ruby style, but with the sediment left in, so it will continue to age, continue to develop, gain these lovely tertiary flavours of like prune and dried fruit and leather and all of those lovely things. But yeah, it will throw lots of sediment, so it's often worth decanting, very gently pouring it into a decanter so you keep most of the sediment in the bottle, and then maybe using a sieve when you get to those last dregs anyway. But definitely worth it.
Okay. Yeah. And crusted port, it's just referring to the fact that there's sediment in the bottle.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Great. And you mentioned about Christmas pudding that you could have. So actually, let's talk about sweet wine in general. Does all sweet wine pair well with food, or particular festive food, as we're on the topic, or are there specific wines that go better with certain foods?
So, yes, they all go well with food, but obviously it depends what you want to pair them with. For example, if we start from a Vinsanto, because of its nutty flavors, nutty character, it goes very well with almond-based desserts. For example, very typical cantuccini, and because I tend to make them every winter. And so, and again, I'm from Italy, so it's really a match made in heaven to dip your cantuccini in Vinsanto as well. It doesn't, it's amazing. And so that nuttiness that goes well and complement in this case. But there are other wines that match well with things that are completely different. For example, a sauterne, and that sweetness and lusciousness goes well with a pâté, which is salty, or blue cheese, which again is salty. And it's a contrast, but it works really well. Then you can, if you want to pair something with a mince pie, you can choose one of our other wines from a Christmas selection, like again the Justenberg Chenin Blanc goes really well. There are other wines that are not in our Christmas list, but we do list, like the Moscato d'Asti. We could pair it with a panettone. It's light and fragrant and very grapey, and it goes well with that kind of dessert. So yes, a lot of good matches, I think. Yes.
Lots of experimentation.
Yes.
Actually, you talk about Moscato d'Asti. So I was always told it was called Nasty Dusty back in the day, because I think people, like a lot of wines, people have a bad experience from
cheap ones.
Yes, and so people thought it was sort of sickly sweet, not very well made, but I love Moscato d'Asti, and I remember a friend of mine recommending strawberries dipped in chocolate to go with it. Now, I had this idea actually when this is really bad, but I basically decided to do like a bit of a picnic the once, have a romantic picnic, and I thought, I'm going to take this, we'll take the strawberries and various things. It got hijacked. The parents-in-law decided to get involved, and so we had a takeaway curry, which was not what I imagined. But actually, seeing as I had the Moscato d'Asti, we paired that wine with the curry.
Perfect
and
match.
it actually worked really well with the spices.
Yes.
So I think people shouldn't be afraid to experiment with sweet wine. And as you were saying before about, pâté and blue cheese and that sort of, we all love salted caramel. So it's that kind of sweet and salty, sweet savoury combination, which just works really well.
And also, keep bringing it back to Christmas, but my mum always makes a turkey curry after the Christmas meal, after we're done with sort of too many leftovers and too much bubble and squeak. And it's very welcome to have some spice, but some sweet wine with that is absolutely delicious, because it just cuts through some of the spicy notes and brings out the aromatics. It's lovely. But speaking of Moscato d'Asti, the other thing that goes really, we're big fans clearly.
Yeah, clearly.
The other thing that goes really well is like fried chicken. Like sort of, yeah.
I've never tried that.
Yeah.
So nice because it's so salty and greasy,
okay.
and then it just like cuts through. It's lovely.
That I like. So I've done champagne and I've done Riesling with fried chicken.
Yeah.
But
Next.
not Moscato. Yeah,
Moscato.
that's the next
Next.
sort of it. Are there any other sort of food pairings do you think that would work really well at Christmas?
I think sometimes chocolate desserts can be quite
Yeah.
hard to pair alongside. But I think your sort of ruby ports, your fresher styles of sort of red styles, or even like a banyuls or something like that, would really cut through some of the richness of the chocolate, but also provide some of that fresh. You know, like raspberries and chocolate go really well together.
Exactly.
So you want sort of that fresh fruit characteristic to counteract
The chocolate,
chocolate.
yes.
because I do
That's a
like a chocolate
good
log.
one.
Yeah, a
It's
Yule
good
log.
dessert.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. I think we can pretty much wrap it up there because we're all salivating right now.
Yes,
So
I'm getting so
we need to-
hungry.
We're gonna go
need
eat a
to find
biscuit.
some panettone, I think, right
Yes.
now.
And
As-
open a bottle of Moscato.
Exactly. You have one at your desk, right?
Always.
Great. So thank you both very much, and thank you to everyone for listening. We hope you enjoyed it. And if you have any questions at all, obviously get in touch. Just touching on decanting, we have some very useful tips online. So, you know, anything that we might be talking about, don't be afraid to either get in touch and ask, or look online on social media for tips and tricks for the festive season. We all hope you have a lovely Christmas.
Yeah, have a great Christmas.
Merry Christmas! Buon Natale!